Have you ever lost sleep over something that never actually happened? A job interview, a breakup that hadn't occurred, an imagined failure, a confrontation that only played out inside your head. Your heart pounded, your stomach knotted, your breath grew shallow. And yet, when you stepped into the moment you feared, it was either nothing like you expected, or it never happened at all. But the suffering, that was real, and it lived entirely in your mind. Seneca's words, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality," strike like a cold truth that somehow feels too familiar. Because you felt it. We all have. There's a kind of torment we inflict on ourselves long before life has the chance to deal its hand. And strangely, that imagined suffering often hurts more than the real thing. Why is that? Why do we rehearse disaster in our minds? Why do we trust our fears more than our capabilities? And what would happen if we stopped believing every story we told ourselves? This video is not about ignoring reality. It's about understanding that most of our pain isn't real. It's a ghost, a whisper, a hallucination projected by the anxious mind. And once we see it for what it is, we can finally let it go. In this journey, we're going to explore the depths of Stoic thought, modern psychology, and real-world examples that will help you see your mind more clearly and break free from the suffering that doesn't actually exist. So take a breath, settle in, and ask yourself, how much of your current pain is simply imagined? Section 2. The nature of imaginative suffering. Suffering, real or imagined, lives in the mind. Your body might feel the effects, the tight chest, the shaking hands, the restless energy. But the origin of that suffering is almost always invisible. It begins with thought, a whisper, a what if. And here's the thing. Your brain doesn't know the difference between something vividly imagined and something actually happening. Let that sink in. If you spend hours replaying a mistake, your body reacts as if it's happening again. If you visualize a future disaster in excruciating detail, your nervous system fires as if you're right there in the middle of it. You're flooded with stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine. Your heart rate climbs, your muscles tighten. And all of this for something that hasn't even happened. The mind is powerful, and left unchecked, it becomes your greatest saboteur. Stoics like Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius knew this truth long before modern neuroscience could explain it. That's why they trained the mind through discipline, journaling, and daily reflection. To build strength where imagination often breeds weakness. But let's bring this into the present. Think about how many times you've suffered over something that only existed in your head. The friend who didn't text back right away. The future job interview you've already failed in your mind. The comments someone made and all the meanings you've assigned to it, none of which they confirmed. You see, we don't just live through experiences, we live through our interpretations of them. And more often than not, our interpretations lean toward fear, insecurity, and overreaction. Why? Because fear sells. To the mind, fear feels like survival. It's ancient, it's hardwired. But in the modern world, most of our fears aren't about actual survival. They're about reputation, control, status, approval. Things the Stoics would say aren't within your power anyway. So ask yourself, how many times have you lived through pain twice? Once in imagination, and again in reality? How often do you suffer in advance? And what would happen if, just once, you waited for the truth before giving away your peace? Section 3. Preparation versus rumination. There's a subtle line between wisdom and worry, between preparing for life and rehearsing your own downfall. The Stoics knew this. That's why they practiced something called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. But don't misunderstand this practice. It wasn't about obsessing over tragedy. It wasn't about becoming paranoid or pessimistic. It was about resilience, readiness, mental strength. Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus believed that by calmly considering what could go wrong, we robbed it of its power. We exposed the monster hiding in the dark corner of the mind and revealed it to be smaller than we feared. But they didn't dwell there. They didn't get stuck in the spiral of what-ifs. That's where we often go wrong. What the Stoics practiced as preparation, we've turned into rumination, an endless loop of worry, mental rehearsal of pain, and a refusal to let go of control. Let's be clear. Preparation is empowering. It acknowledges potential adversity and builds a strategy for facing it. Rumination is paralyzing. It loops the fear, increases anxiety, and weakens your confidence. Preparation says, if this happens, I'll meet it with strength. Rumination says, what if this happens? What if that? What if I can't handle it? One builds you, the other breaks you. Let's use an example. Imagine you're preparing for a big presentation at work. A Stoic might ask themselves, what's the worst case scenario? I forget my lines. I embarrass myself. I don't get the promotion. Then they'd remind themselves, even if that happens, I'll survive. My character is intact. I'll learn from it. That's preparation. That's premeditatio malorum in practice. But now picture someone else obsessing over it all week. Sleepless nights, dozens of imagined failures, hours lost to fear, even physical symptoms, nausea, headaches, anxiety. Nothing has happened yet, but they've already suffered. That's rumination. One is Stoic, the other is suffering. Here's the Stoic truth. Life will throw punches. You don't avoid the pain by pretending it won't. You avoid unnecessary pain by not reliving it 1,000 times before it arrives. So I ask you, are you preparing for life? Or are you tormenting yourself with it? Are you imagining adversity in order to grow stronger, or just to feel more afraid? And if the worst case scenario came true, would you really be as helpless as your imagination says? The Stoics believed we could train our minds just like we train our bodies. And part of that training is learning when to face your fears and when to stop feeding them. Section 4. Fear, fiction, and false evidence. Fear wears 1,000 masks. It pretends to be rational. It pretends to be responsible. Sometimes, it even pretends to be love. I'm just worried because I care. But beneath the disguise, fear is often nothing more than fiction wearing the costume of truth. It's important to recognize something fundamental. Fear, most of the time, is not a reaction to reality. It's a reaction to possibility. Not to what is, but to what might be. The Stoics understood this. Epictetus wrote, "Man is not worried by real problems so much as by his imagined anxieties about real problems." In other words, it's not the situation that breaks you. It's your interpretation of it. It's the narrative you build around it. Fear is born from the story, not the scene. And that story? It's usually exaggerated, biased, one-sided, a highlight reel of the worst-case scenario. Let me ask you something. How many of your fears are based on facts, and how many are built on assumptions? How often do you mistake emotion for evidence? And when was the last time your fear told you the whole truth? Think about it. You fear public speaking because you think people will laugh at you, but has that ever happened? And if it has, did you die? Did your world collapse? Or did you simply grow from it? You fear failure because you think it means you're unworthy, but is that true? Or is that just a script someone else wrote for you, and you've never questioned? Fear is convincing, but it's rarely correct. Here's what fear does. It assumes the worst. It ignores nuance. It forgets your past resilience. And it magnifies uncertainty until it becomes unbearable. And worst of all, fear makes you forget who you are. You forget your strength. You forget your adaptability. You forget your capacity to endure. Stoicism teaches us that fear is not something to obey, it's something to investigate. When fear arises, don't accept it blindly. Ask it for proof. Cross-examine it like a witness. Demand clarity. And if it can't produce evidence, you don't owe it your peace. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment. You can choose to believe a different story. You can choose a response that honors your power, not your panic. You can choose to ask, is this fear trying to protect me or limit me? Is this fear showing me danger or just discomfort? And if I face this head on, what might I learn about myself? Fear may knock, but you don't have to open the door. You don't owe your energy to every fearful thought that passes through. You are not your fears. You are not your feelings. You are what you choose to do with them. Section 5. Real-world application. The illusion of perfection in the digital age. You open your phone. Within seconds, you're scrolling through someone's vacation in Bali, someone else's wedding, a fitness influencer's perfect physique, and a 22-year-old millionaire's motivational post. It's a flood of highlight reels, polished, edited, filtered, and somewhere deep inside, you begin to feel it. That invisible weight, that subtle tightening in your chest, that quiet voice whispering, "Why isn't my life like that?" Welcome to the modern world's most efficient machine for creating suffering through imagination. Social media isn't evil, but it is deceptive. It gives you data with no context, and your brain, trained to find patterns, fills in the blanks. But it fills them with your insecurities. You imagine the full story behind a photo. You imagine how happy they must be. You imagine that they have something you don't. And then you suffer. But you're not suffering because of their success. You're suffering because of the story you wrote about it. That person smiling in the picture. You don't see the panic attack they had the night before. The couple laughing in a sunset photo. You don't hear the argument they had after it was taken. The entrepreneur with the sports car. You don't see the debt, the anxiety, or the 100-hour work weeks they're hiding behind the scenes. What you see is only the surface, and your imagination fills in the rest. Marcus Aurelius would have a field day with Instagram. He wrote, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." Yet in our time, we've outsourced our happiness to an app. You compare your behind the scenes with someone else's greatest hits. And the worst part, you're competing with a fantasy, a carefully constructed digital illusion. That's why so many people, especially young people, feel anxious, depressed, and chronically unfulfilled, even when their lives are objectively good. Because they're not suffering in reality. They're suffering in imagination. They're suffering from expectations, projections, and comparisons to lives that don't even exist in the way they appear. So what can we do? First, we must remember the Stoic principle of control. You cannot control what people post. You cannot control the algorithms, but you can control how you interpret what you see. You can scroll consciously. You can remind yourself, this is not the full story. You can use their success as inspiration instead of ammunition for your insecurity. You can choose to stop writing fictional scripts that cast you as the one who is behind, broken, or not enough. Ask yourself this: how much of your pain is based on someone else's performance? What if your life is beautiful, but you've been too distracted by someone else's filter to notice? And if you turned your focus inward, what might you discover about your own worth, your own strength, your own story? You're not here to be a duplicate of someone else's success. You're here to live your own truth with clarity, purpose, and presence. And that begins by refusing to suffer over the illusions served to you by a glowing screen. Section 6. The Stoic reframe, turning imagination into strength. Your imagination is not the enemy, it's a tool. But like any tool, it can either build or break. The Stoics understood this better than anyone. They didn't aim to suppress emotion or erase thought. They aimed to discipline it, to train it, to channel the chaos of the mind into something useful, something rooted in strength, not fear. Let's go back to premeditatio malorum, the practice of imagining adversity. A Stoic wouldn't dwell on fear for the sake of suffering. They would explore it so they could face it without panic. They would step into the fire mentally, so if it ever arrived, they were already fireproof. But the Stoic didn't stop there. They also reframed suffering. Instead of seeing pain as punishment, they saw it as a path. Instead of seeing discomfort as a signal to run, they saw it as a signal to grow. And instead of seeing fear as a wall, they saw it as a doorway. That's the reframe. It's not the thought that hurts you, it's what you do with it. Let's say your mind whispers, "What if I fail?" A fear-based mindset responds, "I'll be humiliated, I'll lose everything, I won't recover." But a Stoic-centered mindset responds, "If I fail, I'll learn, I'll adapt, I'll come back stronger," because failure is feedback, it's fuel. You see the shift? Same trigger, different interpretation, radically different outcomes. This is the power of conscious awareness, of choosing your response instead of reacting on autopilot. Here's a simple practice, a Stoic filter for your thoughts. Name the fear. Don't let it stay hidden. Bring it into the light, write it down, challenge it. Ask, what proof do I have this will happen? Prepare for it. Ask, if it did happen, how would I respond with virtue, with strength? Shrink it. Ask, will this matter in 5 days, 5 months, 5 years? When you run your fears through this filter, something changes. They lose their sharp edges. They lose their power. And suddenly, your imagination is no longer your enemy. It's your ally. This is what modern Stoics like Ryan Holiday practice. When he feels fear, he doesn't run. He reframes. He gets curious. He asks, what is this teaching me? Where can this take me if I face it with courage? That mindset is available to you right now. It doesn't require perfection. It doesn't require pretending you're fearless. It just requires choosing strength over surrender. So I ask you, what if you used your imagination to build courage instead of catastrophes? What would change if you stopped asking, what if it all goes wrong? And started asking, what if I rise anyway? What becomes possible when you stop rehearsing your pain and start rehearsing your resilience? Your mind is a forge. Your thoughts are the fire. And you are the blacksmith. Shape wisely. Ask yourself this: how much of your pain is based on someone else's performance? What if your life is beautiful, but you've been too distracted by someone else's filter to notice? And if you turned your focus inward, what might you discover about your own worth, your own strength, your own story? You're not here to be a duplicate of someone else's success. You're here to live your own truth with clarity, purpose, and presence. And that begins by refusing to suffer over the illusions served to you by a glowing screen. Section 7. Final reflection. You are not your fear. Take a moment, not to think, but to feel. Breathe in, hold it, let it go. Now ask yourself, what have you truly been afraid of lately? Not just the surface level worry, not just the excuse you give when someone asks how you're doing, but the real fear beneath it all. Is it fear of failure, of being forgotten, of not being enough, of losing what you've worked for, of never becoming who you know you could be? Whatever it is, hold it in your mind for just a second. Then ask yourself, is this fear rooted in truth, or just imagination running wild? Because most of the time, it's not the fear that holds us back. It's the belief that our fear means something more than it does. But here's what the Stoics knew, and what you must remind yourself again and again. You are not your fear. You are not your anxious thoughts. You are not the story your mind tries to sell you in the dark. You are what you choose to do next. You are what you practice when the pressure builds. You are how you respond when your imagination spins its worst-case scenarios. You are the stillness beneath the storm. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire during plague, war, betrayal, and death. But his deepest battles weren't on battlefields. They were within. And through it all, he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He didn't say you'd find comfort. He didn't say you'd find certainty. He said you'd find strength, and strength is all you ever truly needed. So the next time your thoughts spiral, the next time fear begins its silent campaign, the next time your imagination starts crafting a future not yet lived, pause, breathe, return to this truth. You are not a victim of your mind, you are its master, and your life will change the moment you stop feeding your fears and start living your truth. You suffer more in imagination than in reality, but you heal in presence, you grow in clarity, and you rise every time you remember who you are. So stay grounded, stay present, stay stoic.